Hello everyone again, and welcome to the online seminar for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage in the Asia-Pacific region. My name is Takashi, Associate Fellow of IRCI, and I will be your MC for today's seminar. This seminar marks the ninth in our ongoing online seminar series hosted by the Asia-Pacific Research Forum for ICH Safeguarding, a platform established by IRCI to promote research and international collaboration across the region. In addition, today's seminars and the upcoming 10 sessions are being held as part of IRCI preliminary research on intangible cultural heritage and ecosystems. Let me introduce our distinguished speakers. Our lecturer today is Professor Christina Kreps from the University of Denver, where she also serves as the Director of Museum and Heritage Studies and Museum of Anthropology. Professor Kreps holds a PhD in Anthropology and has conducted extensive fieldwork in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia and Thailand. Her expertise in museology and spiritual ecology, a cutting-edge and emerging field, is highly relevant to our discussion on ICH and ecosystems. Our commentator is Professor Taku Ida from the National Museum of Ethnology in Japan. He is specializing in ecological anthropology and heritage studies, with a particular focus on coastal communities in Japan and southwestern Madagascar. Drawing on his field-based perspective, we look forward to his reflections on Professor Kreps' presentation and to an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Now we are honored to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Christina Kreps. Her presentation entitles Spiritual Ecology and the Protection of Environmental and Cultural Heritage.
Okay, shall I screen share now?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you and join in the seminar. And I want to thank Dr. Momoyo Shibuya for inviting me and organizing the seminar, and to Dr. Taku Ida, with whom I've had the pleasure of working with in the past. And so it's a great honor and pleasure to be here working together again. So in my time with you today, I want to share just bits and pieces of previous research as well as more recent research. And my hope is to stimulate discussion on how we can use various forms of tangible and intangible cultural heritage to help address some of the pressing issues of our day. And I'm particularly concerned with, as many of you are, the impact and consequences of environmental degradation and destruction, and especially on the island of Borneo or Kalimantan, Indonesia, where I have worked for many decades. And I'm especially interested in how to bring all these various bodies of research and experience and ideas together to develop a theoretical and methodological approach to environmental and cultural heritage protection that inserts religion and spirituality into the conversation. With this, I'm hoping to build a foundation for a future project in Kalimantan with a community-based environmental conservation NGO in West Kalimantan. I have worked with one of the founding directors on several cultural heritage preservation projects in Kalimantan since the early 2000s, including the development of a women's weaving cooperative and a local museum. So as many as you know, the island of Borneo has some of the most imperiled landscapes and ecosystems on the planet, and some of the highest rates of deforestation, extinction, and loss of biodiversity due to habitat destruction. So the project will be devoted to, I hope, creating an ecocultural heritage protection toolkit in collaboration with Dayak indigenous communities. An important element of the project will be research on historical and contemporary religious and spiritual beliefs and customs that embody an environmental and cultural conservation ethos and value system, as well as actual conservation strategies. So over the past decade or so, I've become increasingly interested in this intersection of religion, museums, and heritage, based on my research in Indonesia on local museology and as well as in Thailand. One thing that has become clear to me over the years is that these indigenous approaches or local museologies, approaches to the care and protection of tangible and intangible cultural heritage, are really inseparable from religion and spiritual beliefs and practices. And despite conversion to the world's dominant religions, the forces of modernization and capitalist incursions, and many people's predictions that with modernization and the world's people would become more secular, and that has not proven to be the case, and that people still hold on to belief in the power and agency of sacred objects and landscapes, as well as spiritual beings and energies. So today, there's a growing body of literature on museums and religion, as well as the nexus of nature, culture, spirituality, and as well as conservation efforts, which, among other things, considers how religion and spirituality shape interactions and relationships between humans, nature, and other than humans, human beings. So though I'm in the pretty early stages of reviewing this literature and on the subjects, and have just been able to dip my toe into various parts of it over the past few years because of other obligations, I have found several concepts and frameworks and methodologies useful for helping me to try to pull all of these areas of research and interests and experiences together in some kind of coherent framework. Okay, and these I'll just focus on in this presentation are ecological heritage stewardship and protection, which maybe some of you are familiar with the work of Leslie Sponsel, who is an ecological anthropologist. In his book, The Spiritual Ecology, A Quiet Revolution, he refers to it as, quote, the diverse, complex, and dynamic arena of intellectual and practical activities at the interface between religions and spiritualities on the one hand, and on the other, ecologies, environments, and environmentalism. Okay. I've also been inspired by Faisal Sakari's concept of spiritual Anthropocene, discussed in the book, The Camphor Tree and Elephant. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. It's a wonderful book. The Camphor Tree and the Elephant, Religion and Ecological Change in Maritime Southeast Asia. Sakari examines how conversion to Islam and Christianity reshaped local forms of animist and spiritual practice and belief in the highlands of North Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, along with other forces like colonialism, the spread of commercial agriculture, and migration. She examines the consequences of these changes for environments, forests, wild animals, and human life through the lens of what she calls the spiritual Anthropocene. And her aim is to insert into the discussion the Anthropocene, into the now pretty prominent discussions about the Anthropocene, a consideration of religion that is concerned with life other than that of humans. And she argues that gods, spirits, and animals, as well as varied forest denizens or inhabitants, must enter debates on the human impact on the planet if we are to understand how religion is integral to profound and irreversible changes that have fundamentally altered the ecology of Sumatra since the colonial period. Zakari gives a multi-layered and very nuanced account of how religious change and environmental change shape each other using a wide array of methods and sources, such as archival documents, ethnographic literature, folk tales, and field work to construct this very holistic, relational, non-anthropocentric approach to understanding the role of religions and spirituality in environmental and cultural change. And I skipped over ecocultural heritage stewardship and protection, which I think that some of you may be familiar with the concept because it has been popular in studies of ecotourism, biodiversity, and conservation and heritage work for some time now. And it's also a very integrated framework that's concerned with looking at these various intersections of natural environments and human cultures and how they are mutually influential in specific areas. Okay, so I hope that I'm able to show in this presentation that I've also have this very mixed methodology and draw on a variety of sources and methods in trying to construct this framework. Material culture and object-based inquiry, archival historical research, ethnographic fieldwork, and bibliographic research. So let me see here. Switch things around a little bit. Okay. Oops, my cat is creeping into the room. Sorry. So my interest in spiritual ecology and how belief in spirits and other invisible forces have been mechanisms for cultural and environmental conservation was sparked by my engagement with this object, a so-called Rumahantu, or spirit house, in the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History collection. And I came upon it while I was a faculty research fellow in the Smithsonian Summer Institute in Museum Anthropology in 2023. My fellowship gave me the opportunity to look at the William Lewis Abbott collection from Borneo, which I had been wanting to look at for many years and never had the chance to, and pursue my growing interest in material culture and the materiality of religion and spirituality through religious objects in museum collections. So my research during SEMA focused on this 56 centimeter tall spirit house that was collected by Abbott in 1908 while he was exploring the coasts and interior regions of southeastern Kalimantan or Borneo, which at the time was part of the Dutch East Indies. It was found on a riverbank in the forest area and was said to have been made by Dyaks who came downriver to hunt in that area from time to time. And when found, the house contained offerings of food to local spirits. And as you can see on this, or maybe see on this card, it's probably a little difficult. So I'm going to read the inscription from the catalog card. Found in the jungle at Tanjung Pamungkang, close to the seashore. There were three of these little houses, each on a pole about 6 feet high. One was too rotten to bring away. We were told by the Bugis, who are Muslim traders from the southern coast of the island of Sulawesi, that they had been put there by Dyaks who came there occasionally to hunt, although they live some 20 miles into the interior. There were offerings of food in the houses when found, bits of betel nut, nuts, rice, and pig fat, and other offerings. Excuse me, my cat is barking. Okay, in addition to the card catalog, I also found in the archives this map that Abbott had made that noted the villages that he had visited and also the accession numbers of objects that had been collected from the region. And I also found, in addition to this map, a letter that he had written to Professor Otis Mason, who at the time was the director of the Department of Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History. And and in that letter, he wrote, excuse me, the north entrance to which in the letter he wrote provided information that gave a lot more context of the collecting event. And he said the north entrance to Pamunkang Bay is formed by a rather high bluff covered with heavy forest. There's a panturan or watering hole place here, and we found 3 little wooden houses on poles about 6 feet high. Scraps of coconut and bits of rice and other things were inside, and they were decorated with streams of palm leaves. The neighboring Bugis people said they were the work of Dayaks, who occasionally came there to hunt. We stole the best pieces. The third was much too decayed. They were, of course, offerings to the local hunters or Hantu, and there was a question mark there. So in reading this, I began to think about how Borneo has long been what many people call an extractive zone of not only natural resources, but also cultural resources. Natural resources like timber and metals and precious commodities, and cultural resources like the ethnographic objects that he collected, as well as natural history specimens. And Abbott, here is a photograph of him, was born in Philadelphia and to a wealthy family, and he studied medicine, but he did not go on to practice medicine because he inherited the family fortune in 1886, which enabled him to devote his life to a career as a naturalist and an explorer. And in 1899, he built and outfitted a schooner when he was living in Singapore and began a 10-year journey sailing through the Dutch East Indies and along the Malay Peninsula. Over the years, he collected some 7,000 ethnographic objects and natural history specimens for the Smithsonian. So while the Spirit House has a very interesting and fascinating history and biography, if not problematic, and I hope to investigate the object for much more deeply in the future. Thus far, I've used it primarily as a research tool, or what we might call an object of inquiry. The objects of inquiry, for those of you who work with objects-based research, can ignite imagination and curiosity and trigger the kind of speculative thinking that allows us to make and think through connections among phenomenon beyond the objects themselves. They can prompt what the anthropologist Donna Haraway calls tentacular thinking, like an octopus, nonlinear modes of thinking that involve tracking threads and connections and see where they lead you. The Spirit House has been, in the words of Levi Strauss, good to think with, and a catalyst for making these connections and following multiple paths of inquiry. So one of those paths has been ethnographic research, in which I found a lot of really useful references on Dayak spiritual beliefs and practices related to human and human nature relationships and their material manifestations. For instance, in the following passage that I'll read from the French anthropologist Bernard Salado, who is a Borneo specialist, describes guardian spirits that inhabit forests, rivers, mountaintops, and so forth. And his description loosely lines up with what Abbott's Bugis guides told him about the purpose of the Spirit House and how it was found. So I'm quoting from one of Salado's publications. Nature is host to a score of local guardian spirits residing at mountaintops or passes and to certain trees and big boulders. Generally, rather impartial to humans, they may become aggressive if neglected, and travelers are always careful to make offerings when passing a place hosting a spirit. These guardian spirits fall into various categories, such as river spirits, who are rather well disposed, or fig tree spirits, easily irritated. On this earth, a relevant distinction is made between a safe human cultural sphere, the village and fields, and a threatening outer natural world, the forest. Negotiations with spirits are carried out on a daily basis by the individual or nuclear family, primarily entailing propitiation or making offerings of sorts to the spirits to repel spiritual danger. So the spirit house has taken me back, taken me on many journeys, and it's taken me back to my own field work and reminded me that I'd often seen these platforms, altars, or shrines festooned with plants and yellow and red flags, which I have since learned are placed there to attract the spirits and please them, with as well as with the offerings of things like tobacco and rice and coins and water and so on. And I noticed that these had been often placed on the edge of rice fields, on the entrance to villages, or the paths into forests, as Abbott and his crew observed more than 100 years ago. So interest in what I learned while working on a project for the Worldwide Fund for Nature Indonesia program in East Kalimantan in 1996 and 1997 also has been reignited by the Spirit House, taking me back to that work and the places there in East Kalimantan. And the project, which Bernard Salato coincidentally invited me to join.
Christina, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have some trouble with screen sharing.
Oh,
so your screen hadn't been actually shared. So we have been following the slide on our side, but I think it's better to share the screen from your side.
Okay.
You try to.
Let me see what happened here.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm very sorry. That must have been really frustrating.
That's good. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So we are starting again from here now.
Okay. I was wondering why I was not seeing images of people, myself included. So that explains that. Okay. So going back to the Kayan Mintarang project that I was involved with in 96 and 97, which was involved conducting a feasibility study for the development of community-based nature and culture centers in, I'll go back to that one, in villages in around at that time what was proposed as the Kayan Mintarang National Park. And the project was called the Kayan Mintarang People's Museum Development Program and was just one component of this much larger Mintarang conservation project. And so the long-term goal was to create a conservation management plan for the park in collaboration with local community members and government officials and various agencies like the Ford Foundation as sponsors. And so central to the project was the goal of integrating indigenous ecological knowledge and approaches to land and resource management into a conservation management plan. So consequently, the first stage of the project consisted of field studies throughout the region in which research groups that were made up of local and international researchers, including conservation biologists and primatologists, ethnobotanists, cultural ecologists, and anthropologists. They traveled to various villages gathering information on traditional ecological knowledge, ethnobotany, and the harvesting and use of various plants and forest resources. So this is just an example of a couple of the many publications that came out of that project over the years. On the left, it's basically culture and the preservation of culture and nature. And I did have a chapter in that book, published in like 1998. And so this research was particularly important on the traditional systems of land tenure and management, because of the strong emphasis in the program on the intersection of cultural and natural heritage. And so land tenure and management, which was known as Tana Ulin in the region, involved restricting access to and use of certain plots of land and areas of forests, for instance. And today, most Dayaks are, of course, engaged in some form of wage labor, but historically, they have been subsistence hunters and gatherers, and as well as dry rice shifting cultivators, which has made this approach to land management critical to environmental sustainability and their survival. So Tana Olin has been and still is governed by Hukum Adat, or customary law, comprised of a set of laws, regulations, and protocol established and enforced by a village Adat council. So Tana Olin and Adat can determine or dictate what areas of land can be cultivated and forest resources used or collected, by whom, and when, according to ascribed rights and privileges. Permission must be granted by the Adat Council to enter and use certain lands and resources. Now, I read that in pre-colonial times, Adat was inseparable from religion and culture and governed nearly every aspect of Dayak life. But during the Dutch colonial period, a new definition of religion independent of Adat and culture was instituted, and many aspects of that was carried over by the new Indonesian independent government. So among the volumes of ethnographic data collected by the Kayan Menterang project researchers were examples of traditional beliefs regarding the spirits of certain precious natural resources like sandalwood, gorahu, and researchers describe how collectors must take precautions when collecting these commodities, such as wearing certain clothing of certain colors, or by making offerings to the sandalwood spirits. And so they also described a practice of making offerings to spirits before embarking on journeys or engaging in risky activities like hunting or fishing or clearing patches of forest for rice fields or ladang. So Tana Ulin, regulated by Hukum Adat, was a significant locus of research because a fundamental tenet of the program was the intersection or the belief that environmental conservation is inseparable from cultural conservation, and any future management plan for the park had to take this integrated approach. So this brings me to another area, another strand of work. I was invited to work on the Kayan Menterang project based on my research on museum development in Indonesia and my 18-month ethnographic study in 1991 and 92 of the Provincial Museum of Central Kalimantan, Museum Balanga, for my doctoral dissertation in anthropology. So this was a long time ago. The fieldwork at the museum was guided by two main research questions. One was, what is the role of the museum in national development and modernization in Indonesia? And two, how is the Western museum concept interpreted and applied in this non-Western context? So when I first visited Indonesia in 1989, upon the invitation of the Directorate of Museums of the Ministry of Culture at the time, I was told that Indonesians were, quote, not yet, belum, not yet museum-minded. And because Indonesians were not yet museum-minded, it was the job of the ministry and the directorate staff to educate the citizenry on what a museum is and does. And it was their job to help people become museum-minded. And so the director of the directorate recommended that I conduct a study of Museum Balanga because it was located in Palangkaraya, the provincial capital, which was a rather out of the way place where people, he said, had no idea of what a museum is. And so a third question that drove my research was, well, what does it mean to be museum-minded? And how do people become museum-minded? So the main finding of this research was that the people of Central Kalimantan were already museum-minded, and they had their own ways of taking care of and preserving what they valued, which I labeled or saw as forms of indigenous or local indigenous curation and local museology, and approaches to safeguarding both tangible and intangible cultural heritage. So my interest in the intersection of religion, museums, and heritage protection grew out of this research and observations on how beliefs and practices associated with the traditional religion of Najudaya people in Central Kalimantan, known as Kaharingan, were fundamental to approaches to the care, interpretation, and display of certain objects in the museum's collections. For instance, on several occasions, I observed how staff called upon Kaharingan ritual specialists known as Basir to help them curate collections and exhibitions. They enlisted help of the Basir out of respect for the customs and beliefs associated with Kaharingan objects, such as these here in the slide, that were used in rituals and ceremonies, for example, for healing. So the museum staff asked the staff asked the Basir to come because they wanted to respect the specialized knowledge of the Basir and their rights, that only those people have the rights to this knowledge and to use it. And the museum staff were highly cognizant of the need to respect that. And so during the production they not only came in to help them interpret these objects, but they also helped them install and create exhibitions with the collections from the museum. And so here is a slide of, on the left, some of the Basir that actually came in and constructed these structures that are used in an actual Tiwa ceremony, which is a secondary burial and mortuary ritual that Naju Dayaks are very famous for. And so in order to make it an accurate representation of that ritual, they just brought in the people who make these for a real Tiwa ceremony, which are the Basir. And so they arranged them all in the pieces, the objects, and these structures in their appropriate positions. And then at the end of this installation, on the right, you see, you can't really see one of the Basirs sitting there, but another one is performing this kind of cleansing, purifying ritual to cast out any lingering bad spirits that might be in objects or be hanging out in the museum, and to invite benevolent spirits to come in and bless the museum and the visitors and the staff, as well as the sacred objects in the collection. So I came to see the Basir's work as this example of indigenous curatorial practice grounded in local cultural traditions as well as religious beliefs and customs and spiritual rights and obligations. And as I've argued in various publications, indigenous curation can be seen as both a form of intangible cultural heritage as well as a measure for safeguarding it. So similar to Dayak traditional ecological knowledge, practices like Tana Ulin and land management and belief in nature spirit, it embodies particular epistemologies and ontologies, or ways of knowing and being in relationship with and protecting for the future things that the community members value. And so my ethnographic work at Museum Balanga and in other parts of Kalimantan launched what has now been decades of research into the cross-cultural and comparative study of museums, curatorial practices, and concepts of heritage preservation, and more recently, the intersection of museums and religion. So here, because I can't go into any great detail about these different case studies, I've shown the Liberating Culture book on the left is based on that early research. It was published in 2003. And then in the center, Intangible Cultural Heritage, edited by Laura Jane Smith and Natsuko Akagawa, there's a chapter in there on indigenous curation as intangible cultural heritage. And then recently, this book that just came out this year, The Museum in Asia, edited by Yunchi Chai. I have a book of article in there on the recontextualization of sacred objects in local museologies. So if anyone's interested, you can look at these publications. So in closing, I hope I've been able to provide you with some examples of how spiritual beliefs and practices, as well as customary laws, can be mechanisms for cultural and environmental conservation and protection. And so again, my aim has been to pull together and work through these various strands of research and experience and concepts and ideas to move toward a conceptual and methodological framework for a more holistic, integrated, relational, and non-people-centered or anthropocentric approach to environmental and cultural heritage protection that recognizes the continued importance of religion and spirituality in people's life. And I also hope that I've been able to convey how objects like the Spirit House in the Smithsonian collection can take us on these journeys that we never imagined and bring us to new insights and realizations as objects of inquiry. So last year, just to wrap up, in April 2024, I returned to Palangkaraya to visit Museum Balanga, and for the first time in over 20 years. And I was shocked at how much Palangkaraya had grown and developed and had become rather prosperous, and which I learned was largely due to the growth of palm oil plantations, logging, and other extractive industries. And so the province had come to epitomize what Anna Singh has called a resource frontier, a conceptual category that she poses that at once both references activities like investment on the part of multinational corporations, as well as extraction and development, and the people and places within those regions of that resource frontier. So the museum had not changed much, however, even though the town around it had changed a lot. The museum, outside of the renovation of exhibition galleries, was pretty much the same, except for this one addition, a kramat, or an offering house, located outside the main collections storage building. And I was really surprised to see this because in my early field work and in subsequent visits in 2000 and 2002, the museum did not have this kramat. And so it made me realize that I had been wrong about my predictions on the future of indigenous curation at Museum Balanga. Because at the time of that early field work in 91 and 92, there were some upper administrators and government officials that kind of looked down on collaboration between museum staff and the Basir because they thought it contradicted the image they were trying to project of the museum as a modern, educational, scientific institution. And therefore, they didn't say you can't have the Basir coming in, but they weren't encouraging it. So I thought, well, eventually it's just these kinds of activities are going to fade away. And as the staff became and the museum became drawn into the international professional museum community and so forth. And so, unfortunately, I cannot say a whole lot about the history of Museum Balanga's offering house. For example, exactly when it was erected and by whom or what particular spirits to which offerings are made. But I can say that it is not a museum object like the one in the Smithsonian or a model of past customs and traditions and beliefs for visitors to see. It's a living altar in active use that is spiritually and physically renewed annually. So while I still have much to learn about this and other offering houses in Kalimantan, for now, I can say that it has more than sparked my imagination and led me to much speculative thinking about the power of guardian spirits inhabiting these kind of extractive zones or resource frontiers like Kalimantan. So thank you very much. And I apologize for not realizing that I was not on shared screen.
Thank you. First of all, I appreciate Christina Kreps for giving a stimulating lecture. And your talk is very impressive in 2 points, I think. First, your perspective is holistic and total. And you include both culture and nature and supernatural things too. And talking of me, my background is ecological anthropology, and I always kept both culture and nature in my scope. But your perspective much more wider.
Oh.
And this is the first point. And the second point is that you always try to embody, or you always try to adapt. You try to adopt the people's perspective. And even in the museum, and even in the field in Indonesia, even in the interdisciplinary academic circles, you always try to get the others' vision. I really appreciate it, and yes, that is the most wonderful things you achieve every time. Every time I read your paper, every time I listen to your lecture, I get impressed in it. Yes, this
Thank
is
you.
the important point of what I want to say first. And you already demonstrated your trial, your attempt to share the perspective with people in the environmental approach, indigenous knowledge, and in the project of the community museum approach too. And I want to know more about your attempt to share your idea of spiritual house in Smithsonian with local people.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah, I want to know it more. Yes.
Well, okay.
And after that, I have another question.
Okay. Shall I say now or wait?
Please do.
Okay. I haven't been able to do very much yet with all of this, but when I was in Kalimantan last year and I was in at Museum Balanga, and then I was also in West Kalimantan, and I had photos of the spirit house from the Smithsonian, and I showed it to people. And I have to say that when I first saw that object at the Smithsonian, I really had a hard time believing it was from 1908. Because as you could see, maybe it's it's in really good condition. And if it had been found in the jungle, it was hard for me. I was incredulous. It was hard for me to understand that. But then with it, there was this box of dried palm fronds and things, and the tag looked like it was from 1908. So anyway, when I showed photos to people at the museum and in other places, they said, "Oh, no, that can't be so old." And but they also were like, "Oh yeah, that's common that people have those, and people still have those." And then actually, I mean, there's so many things I could have said, but I have a colleague who has been doing work. She's from Java in Indonesia, and she's been doing work with on various museum projects. And we did a seminar a couple of years ago at Museum Balanga, and I was telling her about this object at the Smithsonian. She said, "Oh, well, I saw one in Ternate in the Malucus at the museum there. And I think Museum Balanga has one too." And so I was like, "Oh, I didn't know." So I'm really curious to find out more about are these becoming, or have they been common at museums as a kind of protectors? Because I've long said that I felt like taboos and certain prohibitions that people dare not disturb or go into spaces or take things, and certainly saw that in Thailand in the monastery museums, and with Buddha at the Buddhist temples, and people putting things on the Buddha image, and you wouldn't so that those beliefs protect things. It's a way of preserving that I think that doesn't get acknowledged enough, that those kinds of practices are conservation. One of the underlying functions is conservation. But yeah, I think that it's curious about that piece, that spirit house in the Smithsonian, that I really need to go back and dig more in the archives and find out, because there was a lot of discrepancies in the catalog cards. There were two different catalog cards, and the curator had written at one point in the 1980s that one of the objects had been disposed of or something. So it has a very checkered history. And at one point, it was actually in the it was included in an exhibition. It said on the card, 1915 World Exposition in San Francisco. And I did originally have a slide of that exhibition, and I was really looking for the Spirit House in the photo that I found in a catalog from that World Exposition in 1915, but it didn't show a Spirit House in that exhibition. So there's a lot, I hope someday I can go back both to Kalimantan and other parts of Indonesia and start asking people about this, because I find it really fascinating, and maybe go back to the Smithsonian again to do more in-depth research on this object. But
Yeah,
for me,
thank
it
you
was
very much.
just really exciting that so much could come out of just that one encounter with that one object.
Yeah, your project is really exciting because you already internalized the value of Indonesian people, but you make the research in the United States, which the Indonesian people cannot do.
Yeah, in that big collection of, and I have had 3 fellowships at the Smithsonian, but it was never on collections. And I knew about that collection for a long time, but I never had, that was never the focus of my research, because I had been doing all kinds of other things and never focused on collections. So now I'm kind of going back to the very reason why I started doing work on museums, and that was because of the stuff in museums.
Okay. And can I go to the second question? Yeah, the second question is more theoretical, and I'd like
Okay.
to share the screen. Can you see it?
Uh-huh.
In the beginning of your speech, you mentioned 3 frameworks. Ecocultural heritage, spiritual ecology, and spiritual Anthropocene. And I haven't read your references, all the references.
Yeah,
but
because I didn't
to
send
my
them to you.
idea, to my preference, I like the spiritual ecology most. And I will explain the reason. So please give me a criticism if I'm wrong. And ecocultural heritage is much closer to the audience here, I think.
Yeah.
But to my idea, this notion is a bit too objective.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It objectifies things too much. And you talked the nature and culture, but you yourself are observer. And so we have to think of this trilogy. And in the ecocultural heritage perspective, the nature and culture is a kind of one body. But observer always stand outside it, and it observe the whole thing. Yeah, I think this approach has a good point too, because without objectification, we cannot talk of culture or nature. It is really difficult. So it is a kind of a scientific approach.
Yeah, a concept. Yeah.
And secondly, spiritual ecology, it has a bit more different perspective. And in an ecology, the observer always is included in nature. So even the observer have to reflect himself.
Yes.
And in the spiritual issue too, the observer is included in the culture. So without involved in a culture, or religion, you cannot feel the spirituality.
Yeah.
So the spiritual ecology is a more subjective or intersubjective approach. And yes, and when you objectify the nature and culture, the course of them disappears, and you can be the a special point in the ecology and the culture. That is my impression. Just
Yeah,
impression.
I think that's wonderful. I really like that a lot. And it's actually it touches on something I had been feeling, that I consider myself a kind of spiritual ecologist. So it is very subjective in that I'm kind of an animist, that that things have energies and powers, and that you have to respect them, and you have to be aware of them, and our relationships are beyond, that's trying to get beyond anthropocentrism, and not everything does not exist for humans. And so the critique of Judaic Christian religions and everything being so anthropocentric. And so a lot of the readings get into that kind of critique of certain kinds of religions. But this, I agree that it's much more intersubjective, and puts the observer, the researcher, in that. I mean, for me, it's always hard if you don't have some kind of empathy or connection, that if you're so removed from even entertaining the idea that people could believe in spirits, you're not going to be it's not going to grab you. But I always, I always respected how people can say, well, at Museum Balanga, most of the staff were, not all, but most of them were local Daya people, but there were some people who had come from other places and who were Muslims, and this is, I talk about it in this book chapter here, how even though they were non-Dayaks and non-Kaharingan people or Christians or whatever, they're like, well, I don't believe that, but I respect that other people do. And as a staff member in the museum, that, working with the Basir, they did sort of separate, culture and religion because of the government's different organizing ways of looking at things like that. But so they said, well, fine, it's culture. I can work with it as culture. That's fine. So there are these interesting categorizations locally too, where people separate.
Exactly.
So for all kinds of reasons. But there's still that respect, which I really admired at within the staff at Museum Balanga, that they were like, well, no, I'm a Muslim. I don't believe in animal sacrifices and things like that. But other people do, and it's important to them. And I just wish there were more people who are more tolerant like that in the world.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that too. You are becoming animist.
Yes, I think it happened for a long time.
You're more Asian rather than American.
No, I think I've been that way for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's
And,
great. I love this schemata, this diagram. Yeah, it's
okay.
wonderful.
Thank you.
That really helps me a lot too.
Yeah, maybe I can finish it, but I tried to understand the spiritual Anthropocene too. But I have to learn it more. So
Yeah,
I
me too,
may be
actually.
wrong about it. Yeah, and I think this perspective is again too objective to my impression. It tries to diminish the dichotomy between nature and culture. But and in one age, it is not the problem of age, but to make it simple, let me say, of age. Although in a certain age, nature is more comprehensive to include culture. But in when the human skills, human ability develops, the culture includes comprehend the nature. So the Anthropocene age is you know the age of with necessity to consider more about culture than nature. I think this is the message I get from the Anthropocene discussion. But I may be wrong. And you know, the Anthropocene perspective is a kind of dynamic. I like this
Yeah, that's great.
attitude, but actually they talk less about observer. Whether researcher or whether the community people. So I want to, or I have to learn it more to judge if to make a more productive framework, I think.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people who are very critical of, the Anthropocene still centers humans, it's still a very human, placing the human impact on the earth and giving that agency to humans instead of to nature and other beings. And so there's a lot of the problems with that. I think one of the things that I like so much about that book, thought I had it here somewhere, is that it's like there's another book by it's called The Nutmeg Curse. Have you ever heard of that book?
What is it?
Amitav, gosh, sorry. The Nutmeg Curse.
Amitav Ghosh, yes.
Have you heard of this book?
Not this book. I read another book.
He starts with this one thing, the nutmeg, spice, and how it really launched the age of discovery and people going from Europe to the Malucos to get the spices, and how that led to all kinds of not so great things, especially for the people there in the Malucas. And it says the Nutmeg Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. So he takes that one point and then does this, kind of exploding and tentacular thinking and makes, okay. The Nutmeg Curse, yes. That's funny. Yeah, so we're thinking on the same lines. But I like this idea of starting with one thing, like the camphor tree or the nutmeg or the spirit house. And then what can you do with, how can you build out from that these amazing stories that are very interconnected? And he goes from that to talking about the contemporary, goes deep into that history of the spice trade and the Dutch and the Portuguese and all the massacre of Banda, and but then ends up talking about how that's led to that kind of extractive thing, has led to us where we are today with so many of the problems that we have today. So that I kind of was inspired. I had started reading this before the Spirit House encounter, and then I was like, oh, so.
Okay, I will read it, that book.
Thank you, Professor Kreps and Professor Taku, for sharing your valuable expertise and insight with us today. I hope we have all gained significant knowledge from your presentations. And we have now reached the conclusion of today's seminar. On behalf of IRCI, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to our esteemed lecturer. Thank you once again for your active participation and attention.